Missoula Board of County Commissioners. I'll call this meeting to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Missoula County acknowledges that this event today takes place in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We have a couple public announcements today. First, Cheryl, would you like to give any instructions to folks participating today?
Hello, everyone. If you're joining us for this meeting virtually today, instructions for closed captioning are on your screen. If you're joining us in person, we will have closed captioning on in all the screens here in the Sophie Moise room. And we also have assisted listening devices available. Please come to me if you would like one, and I'll get it for you. We ask that all speakers today please remember to speak slowly and clearly during the meeting. This helps with the accuracy of the closed captioning. There will be multiple chances during the meeting for public comment virtually. During those times, if you would like to speak, we ask that you use the raise hand feature. If you are in Microsoft Teams, this is the small hand button. If you're calling in on the phone, you'll need to hit *5 to raise your hand. Then once called on, you'll need to hit *6 to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you. And the assisted listening devices were last tested in 1986. Is that right? No, just joking.
No, we got new ones.
Okay, they should be working. Thank you.
That's fine.
All right, we have one proclamation today recognizing Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Commissioner Vero, would you like to read this, maybe?
Happy to. Whereas activist and civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birth we celebrate on the third Monday of January, was the third person in U.S. history to be recognized by a federal holiday. And whereas through his courage and powerful message of hope and nonviolence, he devoted his life to addressing injustice, racism, and fear with peaceful protests, unity, and understanding, moving millions of Americans to enact profound social changes. And whereas he endured imprisonment and adversity in the form of verbal and physical attacks, threats, arrests, and ultimately was assassinated in an effort to diminish his great dream of freedom and equality for all people. And whereas our nation remembers Dr. King's commitment to the principles of this nation, which he championed through his unyielding faith in justice and unwavering belief in freedom and equality for all. And whereas Missoula County and the city of Missoula strive to be welcoming and inclusive communities where we continue to deepen our understanding and practice of providing equal dignity, respect, and opportunity for all who live and visit here. And whereas Dr. King's legacy and writings teach us that we are ultimately measured not by where we stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but by what we take on during times of challenge and controversy. Now, therefore, in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we, the Missoula Board of County Commissioners and Mayor, and Mayor Andrea Davis, do hereby recognize January 15th, 2024 as Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and invite all citizens to consider this quote of Dr. King's life. This quote of Dr. King's. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?
Thank you for that. Is there any public comment on items not on today's agenda? And if you're online, please use the raise hand function. If you're in the room, come on up to the microphone. Any comment on items not on today's agenda? Okay. Seeing none, our current claims list is, and this would be claims received as of December 26, 2023 through January 3rd, 2024 by the Commissioner's Office. Total $926,917.64. If you want to drill down into what those claims are more precisely, go to the agenda and you can click on the link to see what those all amount to. Also, just an introductory note before we get going on our public hearings today. I am Dave Strohmeyer. You might see me sitting in the position of the chair today, and that's because a tradition of the Missoula County Commissioners is to rotate the chair position every year. Commissioner Slotnick was the chair last year. I will serve as the chair this year. Unless there's some radical coup d'etat, Commissioner Vero will serve as chair next year. So we have two public hearings today. The first is related to a petition for annexation into the Missoula Rural Fire District. We do have someone here to present this to us.
Hi, I'm Lisa Frost with the Missoula Clerk and Recorder's Office. A petition to annex land into the Missoula Rural Fire District has been submitted to the Clerk and Recorder. The property proposed to be annexed is legally described as the east half of the west half of the northeast quarter and the east half of the northeast quarter of Section 24, Township 12 North, Range 19 West. The physical address of the property is 10250 Bear Run Creek Road in Missoula. The petition has been signed by property owners who represent at least 40% of the acreage and 40% of the taxable value of the property to be annexed. A notice, excuse me, of hearing has been published twice in the Missoulian, and all property owners have been notified of this hearing. This petition is now presented to the board for your decision.
Lisa, I think ours says 10260 Bear Run. Yes, you're correct. 10260.
Okay, maybe we can
Sorry.
correct that in the RCA, which stands for the request for commission action. Is the petitioner here? Would you like to come up and say anything about this highly controversial item today? That is a phrase I rarely hear in this room. So maybe with fire district petitions is different. But okay, this is a public hearing. Is there anyone in the room or online who would like to speak to this? Okay, seeing none, we will close the public hearing. Any questions?
Nope. I move to approve the Missoula Rural Fire District petition.
I will second that. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That is unanimous. Annexation complete.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Drive
joining us.
safely.
Yeah, drive safely on this snowy day.
Okay.
We will roll right into our second public hearing today. This is on a resolution of intent to amend the Missoula County Floodplain Hazard Management Regulations. And Matt Heimel is here with us with a staff report.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Matt Heimel, a planner and floodplain administrator with Planning, Development, and Sustainability Department for Missoula County. And just a moment, I'll bring up a PowerPoint that we have. Okay, so as you said, this is about a resolution of intent to amend the floodplain hazard management regulations, which I'll refer to as floodplain regulations in short. I'm going to touch on some very general key points through my presentation. However, if at any times you'd like some more detail, please feel free to just ask. So first, I'll give a broad overview of the National Flood Insurance Program. I'll talk about the purpose of amending the floodplain regulations, why this action is being considered at this time. I'll give a little bit of a summary of the process to get here. I'll speak about the resolution of intent. I'll give an overview of proposed amendments, and I'll present some conclusions and a recommended motion. And after a motion is considered, I do have one last slide about the next steps in our process. So the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP for short, makes federally backed flood insurance available in communities that agree to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations to reduce future flood damage. Flood insurance and funding for other projects, such as mitigation and recovery, is made available by the federal government, and then the participating communities are charged with ensuring that development in regulatory floodplains is in accordance with federal, state, and local laws. As a participating community in the NFIP, Missoula County is required to demonstrate that we have adopted a floodplain management set of regulations that meet those minimum state and federal standards, or with any higher regulatory standards that we found to be locally appropriate. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, will prepare floodplain maps and determine specific flood hazard areas with applicable flood insurance studies. The community will then use those maps and data as available as the basis for regulating new development or alterations in that regulated flood hazard area. And as part of this working relationship between the county, the state, and FEMA, every building in a participating community may be covered by a flood insurance policy, even buildings that are not actually located within the mapped floodplain. And Missoula County has had flood hazard management regulations since 1975. Those regulations have been updated about 12 times since then to update standards or implement new floodplain maps. And the purpose of our floodplain regulations is to promote public health, safety, and general welfare, to minimize flood losses in areas subject to flooding, and to promote wise use of the floodplain. Additional regulatory standards for development and building materials that go beyond those minimum NFIP state requirements, they're actually encouraged by FEMA to provide a greater protection of public health safety. And higher regulatory standards also help reduce countywide flood insurance rates through the community rating system. So why are we updating these regulations? Well, the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, or DNRC, are requiring that Missoula County update the regs. And the catalyst for requiring these updates was actually finalization of floodplain mapping for the Clearwater River. And updated maps for the Clearwater River were finalized in October 5th of 2023. And this gets back to a major underpinning of the NFIP that I said, that where FEMA publishes maps and the community must demonstrate that the regulations are compliant. And it turns out that state model regulations and federal code in the floodplain haven't updated, so we need to catch up. And the DNRC authorized a two-phase approach to having our regulations updated. The first phase was already considered last summer and was finalized on August 28th, 2023, when the regulations were amended to reference an updated Clearwater River flood insurance study and flood insurance rate map. Nothing else changed other than that reference to updated maps. Now we're in the second and final phase, which is actually to update our current regulations per the model or ordinance and updated federal code, so that we come into updated compliance. And the county's implemented floodplain regulations with a very specific format and organizational layout for several decades. And part of what we're doing is really reformatting the regs to align with the model layout. And that's necessary to ensure that we're fully compliant according to the state. And it also helps facilitate any assistance that we need. So if we have a flood event and we need assistance responding to substantial damage claims or permitting, then any external staff, such as DNRC staff, will be familiar with the layout. They'll know, for example, that the flood fringe standards are in Chapter 10 instead of having to learn our layout. So we'll actually be in accordance with the way most, if not all, of the state of Montana is using.
Matt, so why were we why did we have our own system for so long?
The format that we have, I believe, may actually have been a much older state layout that was changed. And I think over the years, Missoula County had adopted some stricter, higher standards because we have many concerns about public health and safety. We really wanted to encourage building techniques that minimized water displacement, minimize the cumulative impacts. So rather than undergo a full rewrite like we had to over the last few months, each time the older layout was revised, I think it just got to the point where we were diverging so much in layout that DNRC felt like it needed to be kind of in the same format. Part of that also has to do with the amount of time that state staff and federal staff would have to take. One thing that was explained to me was that if we go through one of these cycles where we verify compliance with the state model, there's a policy with FEMA, from what was explained to me, that if a community is not in alignment with the layout of a model that the state has, then the federal staff has to do their own checks. So it increases the amount of time. Whereas in the future, I think it will just be the state if we're actually in their model, because then they'll have already verified that we're compliant aside from any other higher standards that we have.
Already compliant aside from any higher standards that this community has.
Yeah, and when I say aside from higher standards, what I mean is that we'll be completely in alignment with the state model as a minimum, and then Missoula County has
As a-
higher
oh,
standards,
okay.
such as elevating residential structures on a stem wall foundation instead of elevated on fill, or how we only allow riprapping on riverbanks in very extreme circumstances and generally prohibit new riprap or new levees. Those are higher.
And it's not because we're being precious. It's because we have a really unique geography, hydrology here in Missoula County.
Well, it could, I bet it could also be that it would benefit. My guess is I'm thinking we're not that unique. It's just that we've recognized that some of these heightened requirements are
Necessary.
beneficial and necessary. That's my speculation.
Okay.
Yep, and we have a section later about those standards and how they compare. Although one thing I'll add as well is that those extra standards for bank stabilization have been in place, I believe, since the year 2000. And like you said, one of the policies that was recognized was the need to preserve natural functions of the floodplain, natural functions of that river system, so that it can have the full carrying capacity in a flood, rather than try to armor certain areas and push that velocity, push that depth, push those impacts further downstream. Any other?
Matt, isn't it also true that some of our higher standards help us maintain our very high or highest insurance rating, and thus keeping premiums to a minimum for property owners?
And that was Deputy County Attorney John Hart. Sorry.
That's exactly right. We are recognized. That's one advantage of having higher standards, is we get recognized for those through the community rating system. And as such, we accumulate different points for different kinds of activities, whether they be higher building standards or more public outreach. Right now, we're sitting at a Class 7, which equates to a 15% reduction in flood insurance premiums for all policyholders in Missoula County.
Thank you, Deputy County Attorney, for that tasty nugget.
I'm sure that was coming up in Matt's outline.
Eventually.
Go ahead.
Okay, so just a few notes about the process. We had many drafting and review meetings between DNRC, county, and FEMA staff that ended up with the draft we have that was then published. We had 15-day public notice prior to this meeting. We had posted that in the Missoulian. We also sent an email with a notice memo to different agencies, developers, and interested parties, roughly 85 in total. And we also posted all of the project information, including all of the applicable documents, on Missoula County Voice, our public engagement website. So we're at the resolution of intent, public hearing, January 11th. If adopted, we'll have a 30-day public comment period and a couple of public review sessions that I'll speak about, ultimately with a February 22nd public hearing about a resolution to adopt these amendments. So I'd like to generally describe how this resolution of intent works. So it is really meant to accomplish three aspects. One, implement the state model ordinance. Two, comply with federal code. And three, clarify existing policies and procedures. So for the most part, existing county regulations are stricter than the state model. But in our review, we found that there are some new significant changes from the state based on federal code, which I'll explain a bit later. So the state model the state model code, like I said, we're completely reformatting the regulations to be in alignment with the model, which was last updated in 2022. And this will make the format in Missoula County consistent with almost every other community in the state. It also adds numerous text elements to definitions, policies, procedures, and development standards, some of which are new to Missoula County or reinforce existing policies. The Code of Federal Regulations, specifically for the NFIP Parts 59, 60, 65, and 70, has some definitions and development standards that needed to be updated. A few examples were clarifying crawl space and subgrade crawl space definitions, and narrowing the types of maintenance activities that can be conducted without a permit, which I'll speak to a bit later. And also the new lowest floor elevation requirements that I'll also speak to. Updates for complying with federal code predominantly come from a FEMA publication called Bulletin P-2140. That will also be available on our website. And then the third part, existing or clarifying existing policies and procedures. So most of the information in Missoula County's higher regulatory standards remain the same, such as those stem wall elevation requirements and strict riverbank armoring policies. Those have been transferred into the model ordinance format. So wherever there was a chapter or section, say, about residential home standards, we pulled in our stricter standards. So we're not rescinding or reducing any of the stringency of those existing higher standards. Some have slightly changed, such as information about maintenance, because we might have had some provisions that could have been interpreted as allowing certain activities without a permit. There are some additions that I'll explain that are being proposed by staff per DNRC and FEMA recommendations, and those are to clarify existing higher standards based on current practice. So a couple of examples, and I'll highlight these later too, are when having some more explanation about when a shaded X flood zone is regulated or how compensatory storage is required. So I'll move on into a overview of our proposed amendments. A few notes. The attachments for this agenda item include a staff report and amended draft regulations. The staff report actually includes a detailed summary of changes for each chapter, and one version of the amended draft regulations includes markups of the changed text. The attached draft amended regulations contain the complete marked up changes, and in this presentation, I'm highlighting some select key points for a summary. I'm not in this presentation going to touch on every single change. However, if there's any questions, just stop me and I'll go over those. So I'm going to go chapter by chapter or section by section and just touch on a few key points. So section 1 of the new format will state title, purpose, authority, and general provisions. This really is just cites laws and the enabling legislation for having local floodplain regulations. And one key change in here is an addition from the state. It's in alignment with existing practice, but we're saying replacement, including like for like replacements of obstructions in the floodplain, do require compliance with the regulations. In section 2 for definitions, the model or ordinance adds new definitions and modifies some others to meet NFIP basic definitions. And that really ensures that our use of terminology is consistent with methods and standards that are intended to prevent adverse impacts of floodplain development. Section 3, forms and fees, that really just describes several documents that we process, and those will now be actually written in the regs. Section 4 describes the regulated flood hazard areas, and this actually has some more substantive changes in the draft. And this section really gets into details on interpreting the regulatory floodplain boundary. The way that we interpret the floodplain boundary is not changing. It's just we have more clarifying text that's in alignment with the state model, and actually some that are in alignment with our policy existing procedures. So a few key points. 1, the maps are a visual guide. So when we look at a floodplain map, it's a visual guide of flood hazard areas. However, we regulate the floodplain based on where the base flood elevation intersects the natural ground. Our regulations will now describe the processes for some different letters of map change if they're either for insurance purposes or for the purpose of actually revising a flood map panel, whether they be a letter of map amendment, letter of map revision, conditional letter, etc. One key change that's been initiated by staff is about the Shaded X floodplain, and Missoula County regulates the Shaded X flood zone. And we're adding new text to clarify that based on two common circumstances. So for our regulatory use, the Shaded X floodplain is an area of moderate flood hazard. It's usually the area between the limits of the 100-year and the 500-year flood. It is also used to designate base floodplains of lesser hazard, such as an area protected by a levee from the 100-year flood, or areas with shallow flooding during a base flood with an average depth less than 1 foot or a drainage area less than 1 square mile. That's the base NFIP term for Shaded X floodplain. So we have two clarifications, the first of which is addressing areas with no base flood elevation, such as an area with sheet flow zones, most commonly seen in the South Hills area off of Lower Miller Creek. And the text in the regulation sounds very technical. However, essentially what we're going to be saying is we look at adjacent grade. We might not require a permit in all circumstances because some areas might be either artifacts from older HUD mapping for sheet flow hazards, or some areas might actually be just higher elevation than known flood paths and we don't need a permit. Whereas right now the regulations just include Shaded X as part of the regulatory floodplain, and it puts some people in complicated situations when maybe we can just look at the terrain and make a decision based on that. The second clarification addresses riverine floodplains where base flood elevations are established, like Zone AE. And essentially what we're saying is that if a property is above base flood elevation in the Shaded X floodplain, we may exempt them from requiring a floodplain permit. A few key points on sections 5 through 8. Section 5 describes uses allowed without a permit within the regulated flood hazard area. DNRC and FEMA are requiring some changes that more narrowly define how some uses, particularly open space uses, can be allowed in the floodplain without a permit. And they can only be allowed without a permit if they don't require a no-rise certification for the floodway, or if they don't have otherwise any potential for significant adverse impacts. FEMA was also requiring changes to maintenance provisions in both the model and county regulations to tighten up certain uses that previously could be considered allowed without a permit. In section 6, where we go over prohibited uses, activities, and structures within the regulated flood hazard area, we, per DNRC recommendation, have more explanation as to the operation of mechanized vehicles. Right now, our regulations prohibit the use of all mechanized vehicles on a riverbank. However, we may permit some activities on a riverbank that need the use, and we do actually approve some of those. So it's really just saying they're prohibited unless otherwise allowed by permit. And we're also clarifying some access standards. Right now, residential use is prohibited if it has access that's subject to certain depth and velocity in a flood, and we're clarifying that that's only for access that is directly attributable to a deep development. We're not going to look at maybe the interstate miles away for a certain permit. Section 7, not many significant changes there. We're just describing operating procedures for floodplain permit review. One note that I'll highlight here that applies to various sections of the regulations is that DNRC is recommending, it's not a requirement, it's a recommendation from DNRC that all review times, whether they be permit review times, appeal review times, or variance application review times, that those be increased from 60 days to 180 days. And the reason for that is per DNRC, it will provide additional time for any engineering analysis as needed from the state without otherwise compromising the county's time frame. If that is adopted, it does not mean that we're going to extend these project timelines out. We're not going to slow down permit reviews just because the timeline changes. Our goal will be to maintain as short of a time frame as practical as we can to make sure that the permits are reviewed against the regulations. We don't want to stretch these out just because the time goes up.
So if you get required materials back in 60 days, in other words, you're not going to sit on it for another 55 days before you crack it open.
Right. We will review them, as they come in, as time permits, as our priorities allow us to, based on all the other applications that we have. If the review timelines go from 60 to 180 days, it doesn't mean we're going to wait over 100 days to actually get started. That's not good practice. It's just, this is really to allow for extreme circumstances when there's a very complicated project that needs time, and that way we don't run into a situation. Another thing DNRC highlighted was some communities might experience staff turnover with a floodplain administrator, and they don't want to force the community to then have to be sitting on a strange timeline issue in case needed. But this doesn't practically mean we're actually going to then just wait.
Thanks.
Sure. And then Section 8, application evaluation. So Missoula County has higher standards in our review criteria. We look at a number of factors that are not in the state model, so we actually just carry those over into the model. So that's why some viewers might see many changes in that section. It's really just us carrying over our current review criteria, which are not changing. Okay, so for the next short while, I'll talk about sections 9 and 10. And these are actually where we look at the development standards. So section 9 is for development requirements in the floodway being the flood zone that must remain clear of obstruction to permit the passage of all base flood water without having any rise in that flood depth. It's also the most hazardous flood zone where we would expect the greatest depth and velocity of flood water. So the standards for development in the floodway are extremely strict. So there are numerous changes in the floodway section being required by DNRC and FEMA, and these primarily clarify or reinforce policies and procedures that we already have to really just add more text and explanation to ensure there is no adverse impact of development in the floodway, and that we have all necessary engineering certifications for projects in the floodway. One helpful addition actually for our floodway chapter will be clarifying that there's an option for minimal or qualitative encroachment analysis. An encroachment analysis is intended to demonstrate that a project has, or that a project will have, in effect, no rise with floodwater, that it will not cause any rise in the flood depths that have been established for the floodway. However, some projects, such as replacing a fence or adding material in response to a erosion event adjacent to a highway, sometimes these are really a return to pre-existing conditions, and they warrant just a qualitative analysis. And we do have those in some permits that we review and approve, but it's not written. And so now we'll actually have that in our code. And as we discussed earlier, all of Missoula County's strict higher standards for bank stabilization have been transferred into the model format. There are no changes to our strict policies regarding bank stabilization and levees, but I will point out there are new standards for stream bank restoration. We did add text to the stream bank restoration section to make sure that there are no conflicts with restoration projects. For example, if a restoration project is actually going to have bank stabilization, then it has to otherwise comply with our bank stabilization section. Section 10 is development requirements in the flood fringe or the regulated flood hazard area with no floodway. And when I say regulated flood hazard area with no floodway, that sounds a little confusing, but what that means is you either have flood fringe, which is like zone AE floodplain, or the flood hazard area with no floodway can be either maybe an AE that doesn't have a necessary floodway with it, or the zone A approximate floodplain where we haven't had the base flood elevations established through a study.
Do you,
Yeah.
do you example that we can visualize like of that?
Sure, I can pull up the.
Or you don't have to, or yeah, or is
Or
there
just
do you know of a place that this?
So Butler Creek and Laval Creeks upstream of the interstate are zone A that are approximate floodplains. The only zone AE without a floodway that I can think of right now is the lowest stretch of Miller Creek. Lolo Creek, most of it upstream of the immediate Lolo area, is a zone A approximate floodplain as well.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
We
I was
can
having
also look
problems
at the.
visualizing it.
Sure. If it helps, we can pull up the map as well, and I can show some of those.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and pull it up? I'm
Or recording.
barely following along on some of this, so.
Oh, I don't have a particular address. Let me I'm actually switching over right now. So for anyone watching along, this is our interactive floodplain map viewer. This provides a great wealth of information about floodplain designations. And right now I'm showing an area upstream of Lolo. And so you can see Lolo has a detailed study from its confluence with the Bitterroot River. Then after a certain portion, it becomes this blue color. And what that means is that the detailed study by FEMA ended at this point, and this is an approximate base flood depth. So we don't actually have detailed study information for Zone A floodplain. It's Zone A, just an approximate extent of a base flood depth. So currently for any permit applications for Zone A floodplain, we do require that an engineer conduct a hydraulic analysis if there are any elevation requirements that need to be met.
Who created the did the mapping for the approximate Zone A?
The approximate Zone A is mapped by FEMA.
It too is mapped by FEMA. Okay.
Yeah. Ideally, new maps will not have Zone A floodplain. It's we're trying to correct as time goes by. I'm also panning to Miller Creek, and here's an example where you can see the Clark Fork River, or I'm sorry, the Bitterroot River, excuse me, is on the left-hand side of the screen. And directly upstream of its confluence is only this pink color on our mapping, which corresponds to a Zone AE. Note how the just upstream of it, we have mapped floodway. However, in that lower portion, there is no designated floodway. So it is possible that we might require an encroachment analysis because the floodway has not been mapped. So what that means is that the cumulative impact of development in that flood fringe area, that the floodplain, has not been determined. So the limit of encroachment will be 1/2 foot.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
This is really helpful. I needed the maps. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so, I'll add full screen. So this section 10 has the most changes. They are largely required by DNRC and FEMA to reinforce protection against adverse impacts and promote public health and safety. Just a few key points. Wet and dry floodproofing standards are being consolidated with these updates. So in the current regulations, wet and dry floodproofing standards are pretty scattered. And so wet floodproofing means that there are building construction methods that actually allow floodwater to enter an enclosure of a structure. However, the floodwater is designed to automatically enter and exit, and the building materials are largely resistant to significant damage. Although those, there are standards that these need to meet and engineering certification requirements. Dry floodproofing is just the opposite. It's designed to resist infiltration of water in the structure. Residential enclosures cannot be dry floodproofed, and dry floodproofing has a very high bar where we do need to have an engineering floodproofing certificate. Also, our fill standards are being consolidated and updated. Please excuse the typo that says updating. So similar to floodproofing standards, our standards for the addition of fill in the flood hazard area are a little scattered. So we're putting those in one section in alignment with the model standards. One clarifying note, one of our higher standards is the provision for compensatory storage. And what that means is that for fill brought into the flood fringe that might otherwise displace more water, we can require there to be flood storage excavated on a property to mitigate that impact, to mitigate that possible increase in flood depths. However, it might not be appropriate in all circumstances. So compensatory storage may be appropriate in an area that is flatter, maybe with lower velocity of floodwater. However, there can be some areas that are more narrowly constricted. The water is faster, higher velocity, and in effect, it'll just be a hole that gets filled in faster. So some areas we may require. So that's why in our draft regs, we say compensatory storage will be required for all fill when deemed necessary, pursuant to certain factors that we have listed. So the most significant changes that we're going to see to our floodplain regulations will be in section 10.4, and primarily this is the subsections for elevating agricultural and accessory structures. So the lowest floor for any structure will need to be elevated 2 feet above the base flood elevation or adequately dry flood-proofed. And this is a significant change for agricultural and accessory structures because our current regulations allow those structures to be built at existing grade. They can be elevated, but we currently allow them at existing grade, which might actually be below that base flood. There will be some limited exemptions that are available, and I use the phrase a limited exemption because it does not outright exempt them from elevating at all. So an agricultural structure may be exempt from the 2-foot requirement if they're elevated to the base flood elevation with dry flood proofing, and a small accessory structure may be elevated with wet flood proofing to the base flood. And also an accessory structure must be accessory to a principal use. So what that means is just building a detached garage or a shop on a structure in the floodplain. If there is not already an existing principal use like a house, we will have to treat that garage or shop as the principal structure and meet those standards. If it would help, I could go over some examples.
Yeah, a few examples would be good. And that is by virtue of what FEMA is requiring, correct?
Absolutely. So these are required by FEMA. This is a standard that was put into the National Flood Insurance Program in July of 2020, updated in August of 2021. So now that we have the final Clearwater River floodplain maps and are requiring to demonstrate compliance with federal minimum standards, we now have to update this standard. So this is something that's being handed to Missoula County by the federal government via DNRC.
Yeah, thanks. Just want to be clear on what is or is not a heightened requirement of Missoula County, and this is not in that category. This is something that's mandated of us to do.
Yeah, I do want to clarify the 2-foot requirement is a state higher standard. So in Montana, the lowest floor requirement is 2 feet above BFE. The minimum federal requirement is just to elevate the lowest floor to the base flood elevation. That's why we're able to have this exemption in certain circumstances that at least goes to the minimum federal level.
Thanks for that.
Well,
Yeah,
still-
if you have any examples that you can show, that would be great.
Sure. So a key point for thinking about different buildings or structures that need to be elevated is thinking of structures in just the context of when we call it a structure in the National Flood Insurance Program. So some things that we might think of a structure in zoning or building code, for example, like a pole barn with no walls, isn't necessarily a structure in the NFIP, because for regulatory purposes in the floodplain, we're thinking of lowest floor for structures when there are 2 or more rigid walls and a fully secured roof.
So the floor doesn't matter? Is it necessary for a floor to be there or not?
If it's an open-sided structure, or if it's not considered a structure because it doesn't have 2 or more walls and it's not a fully secured roof, we're not so much looking at elevating the lowest floor. There are general development standards that it must adhere to, such as being adequately anchored, having a minimal impact. So as far as, materials in there, if it's being, if the surface of an open-sided pole barn were just to be fill, we still need the fill to be properly
Elevated.
The fill doesn't need to be elevated, it needs to be compacted.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
So I'll go over some examples. So first, that open-sided pole barn, because it doesn't have, as long as it's fully open-sided, doesn't have the walls, then it won't be a structure for this purpose, and it does not need to be elevated. But like I was saying, there are base development standards like adequate anchoring to prevent flotation, collapse, or lateral movement. Another example could be maybe a hay storage building with 2 or more walls. Well, it has 2 or more rigid walls. If it has a fully secured roof, this could be considered an agricultural structure, and it needs to meet the new elevation requirements that are being required by FEMA and DNRC. It may qualify for an exemption if it's generally small size, represents a minimal investment and is really solely agricultural use, in which case then it only needs to be elevated to the base flood elevation with dry flood proofing.
What's the definition of a fully secured roof?
That is a good question. I don't have an immediate answer, but I
Okay.
think it would be one that's not immediately able to
Flimsily
fly away.
constructed? I don't know. Okay. That's all right. Don't.
Yeah, it's a term from FEMA's technical bulletin that we're drawing from, but I can have a better answer with illustrations for our next public hearing.
Excellent. Thank you.
Another example that we talked about is maybe a tool shed or a chicken coop. These, I think we need to look at case by case. If they're walled and roofed, then on a strict interpretation, it's a structure. It needs to meet the elevation requirements, but we're talking about tool sheds and chicken coops. These might be so minor in nature and have so little prospect for adverse impacts that I think we can look at these on a case by case basis. I would want to consult with DNRC if we get one. But on a very strict look, it's walled and roofed. It may be considered a structure for purpose of applying this lowest floor. A detached garage. So a detached garage is currently allowed by Missoula County. One option, there's a few options that someone could use, but one option is to build it at existing grade, which may be below BFE with flood vents. Well, FEMA and DNRC are requiring Missoula County to change that standard to be stricter. The new requirement will be elevating, like I said, the lowest floor 2 feet above the base flood elevation with dry flood proofing. Accessory structures will have an exemption available if they are small in nature, typically no larger than a 1-story, 2-car garage, provided it is elevated to the base flood elevation with wet flood proofing. Since I mentioned garages, I should mention a garage that is attached. So if a garage is attached to the house, so it's not an external structure, it's part of the house, then we still see it as part of the overall residential structure. And that is an existing standard. That's not something that's changing. So someone with an attached garage where it's just a door going out of their main house, that still needs to be elevated like we would need to see a residential structure on a stem wall foundation. And I think I alluded to it earlier, but I want to be really clear again that when we talk about accessory structures in floodplain management, an agricultural structure can be a principal use and a principal structure in a property. However, an accessory structure is different under floodplain management. An accessory structure needs to be incidental and subordinate to an existing principal or primary use. So that means if someone has vacant land in the floodplain and they want to construct just a shop or a storage building, if there isn't already a house, we're going to have to treat it like a house and have it be constructed to the residential building requirements based on the written policies that are being required by FEMA and DNRC. And additional sections in the draft: emergencies, variances, administrative appeals, enforcement, and penalties have no significant changes. There are some minor text changes about policies and procedures, but these don't really represent a change in how we process such requests, other than any timeline that I mentioned earlier about changing 60 days to 180 days, which is a recommendation from DNRC. So I do have recommended conclusions and a recommended motion. However, at this time, if there's any other information or standards that commissioners you'd like me to recap or expand on, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. Well, shall we take some public comment?
Willis is on the edge of his seat.
So unless there's anything you want, is this the point that we are pausing slightly, or is there more that you want to present, Matt? Before we get to the motion.
This concludes the details
Okay.
that I have.
All right, let's open up the public hearing and let's begin in the Sophie Moise room. Mr. Curdy, did you have anything you wanted to share? Okay, we'll see if there are a few comments. If not, you might be the few. Let's go online. Anyone out there joining us virtually who would like to comment on this item? Raise your hand, please. Apparently not. You are the few. Mr. Curdy, come on up.
Thank you, commissioners, and Commissioner Strohmeyer and Commissioner Verrill for this opportunity to comment on the proposed changes to our floodplain regulations. For the record, I am Willis Curdy. I represent Senate District 49, which begins at Lolo Pass, goes down, includes all of Lolo Canyon, Lolo, Blue Mountain area, Big Flat, Target Range, Orchard Homes, Fort Missoula, the area of Mullen Road from generally Grant Creek on the south side of Mullen Road, including the south side of Corner Ranch and the Big Flat, Petty Creek, and the south side of the Clark Fork River from Big Flat down to the mouth of Petty Creek, or beyond Petty Creek, up to the Mineral County line. So as per my, the Senate district I represent, obviously a good share of the number of homes and dwellings and the like that are included in or potentially affected by this change in the floodplain regulations exist within or adjacent to my Senate district. I've had a lot of conversations and concerns from citizens about the changes in regulations. And I guess to the point of frustration about some of the regulations that now come into play after these homes, these people have had residences for literally decades and now see significant changes to the value of their home and to the fact that they would have to purchase flood insurance for the homes. Being myself a resident who has lived adjacent to the Clark Fork River for the last 42 years in the Big Flat, the river generally runs outside my property, my wife and I's property, but during high water, there's a strong likelihood that it will flow into my property. I've had to replace fences a number of years. Those are basically inconsequential, but I have a lot of experience for the past 42 years living along the Clark Fork River. Now, that said, and Commissioner Strohmeyer and Vero, you and I have had a number of conversations and meetings concerning one of our problem areas being the Tower Street, Kirwald, and Channel Drive areas. We have met with the Army Corps of Engineers trying to find a way to ameliorate or remove homes that fall within that consistent floodplain area. Besides that, very few, if not any, maybe along Lolo Creek a little bit, of these areas that are going to be impacted by the new rules have not seen flooding. Okay? And I understand that the recent events on the Yellowstone River, the Clark Fork, the Yellowstone, set maybe a new standard about what can happen to our streams and rivers with changing climates can impact these neighborhoods. But these neighborhoods have been here for a long time. And again, I would really encourage that Mr. Heimel and the commissioners take a really hard look at these regulations before their adoption. I realize that FEMA plays a very big role here. To me, as a state senator and representative for the last 9 to 10 years, I am somewhat taken aback by the 2 feet state standard for a base floodplain or base flood elevation when properties are added within that floodplain area. That is going to that has prompted me to ask DNRC when and how these regulations were put into place. And Mr. Reimel, if the commissioners would be so accommodating, I would like to ask Mr. Heimel that question at this point, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Matt, do you have anything to add there?
Yes, just to clarify, is the question when exactly that came into the state?
Yes, sir.
At this time, I don't know when the state of Montana adopted the higher standard for the 2-foot freeboard. I'd be happy to maybe look into that. At this time, I don't know if I'll have the answer today as to what year that was implemented into the administrative rules of Montana. I will add that freeboard is or additional freeboard is a common higher regulatory standard in the United States addressed to or intended to address possible error in the base flood elevation that in some cases water may be higher than anticipated in a flood insurance study. It can also account, of course, for additional margin of elevational safety so that any sensitive building components, utilities, mechanical equipment are properly elevated above that water surface.
So we can look into that, Willis, as far as a little bit of the history of how that and when that came to be.
And I appreciate that. And I will ask the same of, I want to confirm the same from DNRC. Not, I know you will give me the straight answer, but there are, in many cases, some stories behind what DNRC has done that maybe is not apparent in state rules and regulations. Again, personally, it kind of amazes me, even after 10 years or 9 years as a state legislative representative, and one who sits on a committee which has oversight on DNRC. Again, it just astounds me when I run into new data, new information that I have not encountered during my tenure as a state representative and senator. But anyway, back to the main point here. This change is going to have a major impact on a lot of homes in this area, especially in the Lolo area and somewhat along the Orchard Homes area and even into the Big Flat area. So again, I appreciate your time and listening to my considerations, my questions, and I hope you'll take into serious considerations what is happening on the ground. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Willis. Just one question for you. So of what you've heard from your constituents or that you've thought about personally, are there, whether it's the mapping piece or the other aspects of the regulations and changes being made, do you have any specific concerns? And I'm looking specifically for those areas where we have discretion as opposed to if FEMA is requiring a change, it's kind of like that's what's been handed to us, and I'm not sure that we can do much in that case.
So thank you for the question. So the area that comes to mind to me mostly is the area in Lolo around Red Fox Drive, the lakes, and an area that has been included. I mean, and again, along the Clark Fork River in the Kona Ranch area. Now, that said, my home is outside of the proposed boundary, okay? It runs down through my property, and for me, I can handle that. But there are other homes where we have, like, for example, a cul-de-sac where one side of the cul-de-sac is in the floodplain and the other half of the cul-de-sac is not. And generally you look at it, to me, is the same elevation. Now I know LIDAR does not lie, okay? It's pretty accurate standard. But again, it's those situations where, I'm wondering, it kind of mystifies why, where you take a look at it and it looks like it's the same elevation. One part of a subdivision or cul-de-sac is in and the other is out. So, it's a couple of those, items,
So while we're on that, not to keep you standing more than you have to there, Willis, but Matt, could you speak to the mapping piece, which seems to be mainly, of course, you brought up the 2 foot.
You mean as a guide?
Well, no. So Matt, could you describe how it is that, and just where we are process wise with the new mapping? Because there's much of what you presented today has less to do with mapping per se and more to do with the regulations of what can happen within a flood zone or floodway. With the examples that Willis brought up, has that ship sailed, so to speak, in terms of areas in the floodplain or floodway or not? And just where does that stand?
Sure, thanks. So we currently have draft map data provided by DNRC for the Clark Fork River, the Bitterroot River, and Rock Creek. That data is in a draft stage. We do not have preliminary flood insurance rate maps, nor do we have a preliminary flood insurance study. I would expect those would clarify some nuance in areas. There will also be an appeal period through that. That's its own very distinct process. These regulation updates are really catching up to state and federal standards. Although I fully recognize and acknowledge that there is a map update process that there are a lot of questions and concerns about, that map update is not the basis for any of these changes. Actually, the one map update is just the Clearwater River. On the subject of the map update, we did have public open houses about that map update in October of, last October of 2022, actually, October of 2022. It's been over a year since we had that engagement. And I realize there are still a lot of questions about that. And I definitely think that's a conversation that I want to engage in with the public. However, I just want to say again that it's not the subject for this set of regulations. With questions about, and I was trying to follow along with some of the points, questions about where there might be one end of a cul-de-sac in draft maps that are subject to change and one part of a draft map that is out. Even though the LiDAR is based on 1 foot contours and some areas may look like they're at the same elevation, sometimes these, well, all of the time our flood insurance study data is based on base flood elevations that are calculated to the 10th of a foot. Sometimes the actual hydraulic analysis goes to a 100th of a foot and then gets rounded. So there are a lot of nuances there. And also, like I said a few times, the word draft is key. These are really draft data sets intended to get the general picture out there.
So I guess more to the point, since it is, in some cases, we're talking about draft maps. If for instance, hypothetically, some of the areas that Senator Curdy is mentioning would be within the draft maps, what's the process by which a member of the public, property owner, might want to appeal that or contest what's in the draft form?
Sure. So when we receive preliminary map products from FEMA, we'll have more public engagement and open house. After that time, after ample public notice, there will be a statutory appeal period through FEMA. I believe it lasts for 90 days. And this will be very solidified as we get into the process. However, my general understanding of how that works is that we will have that through that appeal process, people can submit information to FEMA, and an appeal of that information will need to get to the scientific merit of the data of the revised map products that are issued as preliminary rate maps by FEMA. Those typically need to have some sort of surveying or engineering work to demonstrate why it is incorrect. A property owner or an interested party can comment on those maps. And if they don't have certain information that FEMA will need for them to officially, for FEMA to officially consider it as a appeal, it will be taken as a comment. An appeal or a comment those may be considered by FEMA and affect the process. The individuals, I believe, work through the county to FEMA. However, get back to the question before, the ship has not sailed with the draft mapping. We're still really in very early stages, although a lot of time has passed really because I think there is some, the FEMA review is ongoing and we don't have those preliminary maps yet.
So then what are the folks that Senator Curdy's talking about, those concerned homeowners, what are they supposed to do right now?
Right now, my recommendation would be to monitor the process closely, keep in touch with the county planning office or the city floodplain office if they're in the city, to monitor those, look up the maps, keep track of that information, because in some cases, although it might come as really surprising news to some people in the floodplain, it really is based on better elevation data and better modeling of the flood as we know it. So in some cases, we do get a better idea of possible flood risks, again, based on draft data. So really encourage people to keep an eye on it and get in touch with us, and also look into flood insurance and possible retrofitting of their structures as appropriate to.
So is the take-home message, though, the mapping is separate from what we are contemplating here today, the floodplain regulations that, John Hart, you've been wanting to jump in here.
Let me,
Could you put that on the microphone?
I dropped a link into the chats, the Missoula Granite floodplain maps updates from the DNRC Montana.gov website. And on the main page, it has a draft map viewer that you can click on. And it says it's a comparison with the existing FEMA maps and what is the proposal of the
Okay,
new
thank you.
ones.
First, John Hart, then back to you, Willis. I just want to get crystal clear what it is we're contemplating today, how that differs from the mapping, FEMA mapping piece, and how folks comment or appeal that, and just so that everyone is on the same page. John Hart.
Thank you, Commissioners. Yeah, this is John Hart with the County Attorney's Office. Matt, I just have some questions, and the public may too. Do the regulations that you've just introduced to the public today, do these regulations add any property to the regulatory floodplain that are not already in the regulatory floodplain at this time?
Thank you. No, these regulations do not change any floodplain boundaries or add or remove any properties. These are solely development standards. Earlier, I did mention about standard or a section about interpretation of the boundaries. Those changes are largely clarifying existing policies and procedures. But again, these regulations for consideration through the hearing today and on February 22nd, 2024, do not correspond to any upcoming map changes, or nor do they add properties to the floodplain.
Okay, that's important. Willis.
Thanks, John.
So, thank you. I'm sorry if I stepped out ahead on this, but I mean, I'm just responding to the questions and concerns that I'm getting from my constituents. Okay.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Senator. And I don't want to discourage people from engaging in these very preliminary draft maps that the public's been able to see. But and obviously I know the commission want to hear people's thoughts about them, as does Matt Heimel and others. But I mean, they, as I understand it, and I'm somewhat ignorant, well, some would argue very ignorant, but these haven't really even been introduced in the sense that they're ripe for public comment, and that's not going to happen for some time in the future. Is that right, Matt?
That's correct.
And so, just so the public has a sense of timeframes here, any best guess on when they might be rolled out to the public, in which case then there would be a more formal process to comment on the maps?
Commissioners, I really wish I could give a best guess. My last best guess was sometime in early spring of 2023, and that has come and gone. So we really don't have any idea when we're going to have preliminary product. I ask routinely for that information, and we don't have a good update for the time frame. I think the city is working through some levy procedures with FEMA, but until we receive preliminary flood insurance rate maps, I just don't know.
And we recognize that is not a satisfying response.
That's not a
for members of the
satisfying
public. So, John, did you have something?
Oh, well, I'm just curious, are the draft maps for the Clark Fork, Bitterroot, and Rock Creek, are those for the entirety of those water bodies in Missoula County, or are they just for certain reaches?
My understanding is the entire reaches as they are within Missoula County's jurisdiction.
Okay. I'm going to ask you something else, and I'm now free.
Back to,
Sorry.
while John's thinking, back to you, Willis.
So again, thank you for the time. And again, I apologize if I stepped out ahead, but again, people hear about floodplain rules changes, and the first consideration is, okay, where we go back, where does this tie into where we were when I attended the Lolo presentation, and It was a very interesting experience. The one thing I'd like to add, one more thing concerning the appeal process. So when my wife and I purchased the property, our property in the Big Flat in 42 years ago, we were told what the elevation of our house was at that point. And when we purchased, because both of us were really concerned about, being in a floodplain, out of floodplain and the like when we purchased the property. We were told what the elevation was. FEMA came to us and said, you are in the floodplain and you need to buy flood insurance. It took us going to a surveyor and challenging FEMA, which was took years to get us out of the floodplain. So again, I don't know if things have changed in terms of FEMA's response to requests about being in or out, but I can tell you from our experience, it was not a pleasant experience. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any other public comment from folks online? Okay, any other questions, Juanita? So I guess back to you, Matt, to wrap this up for the day.
I was just trying to, and I was asking Matt if he knew of an example of another mapping process that FEMA did in Missoula County and how long it took between the draft maps and the preliminary insurance maps. But he doesn't have, I was wondering if we remember how long that was for the Clearwater River or the Swan River, or it takes an agonizingly long period of time. And it's frustrating for us at a local level because, I mean, this is what happens. Senator Kearney and his constituents, they see the map, this draft map, and they're ready to, talk about it. And then they're told, well, you got to wait for years. And that's frustrating.
Matt, would it be, I recognize you've had perhaps some communications with FEMA. Would it help if a letter drafted from the Board of County Commissioners to FEMA, would that help to try to at least get some rough sense? Are we talking another 2 years, 5 years?
It's going to be round filed.
I mean, I don't know that our voice will bring that much weight, but it certainly would not hurt.
I think it would help to hopefully get at least a clear explanation as to the process, because there's a lot that happens behind the scenes, I believe, on analyzing that data to make sure every part is vetted and proper before it's put in a preliminary map form, and perhaps explaining the great deal of public interest we have in the process and concern over possible flood insurance concerns and development standards. It could show that there is a really good interest in part from the public to warrant that kind of question.
Is that something perhaps you could help us draft?
Perhaps.
Okay, excellent. I like that answer. So back to you, Matt, to bring us to the point of a motion for today and anything else next steps wise you want to present.
I could bring us to a motion.
Thank you. I move to approve the resolution of intent to amend the Missoula County Floodplain Hazard Management Regulations, implementing the state model ordinance, complying with federal code, and clarifying existing policies and procedures based on findings of fact and conclusions of law as presented by staff.
Second, any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next steps.
Okay, we will have documents, including the resolution and draft regulations, available for inspection at our office. We do have the next public hearing on February 22nd of this year, of course. We will have some public review sessions Tuesday, January 23rd from 6 to 7:30 p.m. and Wednesday, January 31st, 9 to 10:30 a.m. That's where anyone can join on Microsoft Teams. Really encourage that and ask. We could get into very specific details, even talk about particular projects or areas to look at how these regulations work. Anyone can contact me for a link to that. My contact information is at the bottom, or visit the Missoula County Voice page that also has a Teams link in addition to a lot of information about this process, including some frequently asked questions and access to these documents. In case anyone is listening but cannot see the screen, I can be contacted directly at 406-258-3799 or send an email to floodplain@missoulacounty.us for any information about floodplain or this process.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you,
Appreciate
Matt.
the in-depth presentation today. And yeah, it was for a floodplain presentation. I only needed 1 12-ounce cup of caffeinated drink. So that's good. Good. Kept me on the edge of my seat. All right. Any other business to come before the commission today? Seeing none, we'll be adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.